evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever the fuck you're tuning in. This is a special episode of Backyard Buckets brought to you by Backyard Sports. We are talking next 24 in line for the NBA's top 100. 75th anniversary. They just released their 75-ish best players of all time. They ended up with 76 because there was a tie in the vote. So perfectly for us, 24 adds up to 100 and it's divisible by 3. I have to point out, I'm going to pass it your way, Bentley, see how you're doing. But I have to point out in the thumbnail here, kind of behind the curtain, your hat was like glittering like one of those sparkle vampires from Twilight or whatever.
Never seen it.
Anyway, how you doing, bud?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm trying to survive this heat wave down here.
Oh,
It's supposed to be 100 degrees this weekend. Not getting any golf in, so that's a bummer. But we survive.
it was described to me today as hotter than Satan's taint, and I could not find a way to disagree. So
Yeah.
um,
Same.
yeah, Dr. Naismith, how you doing? You're the authority here tonight.
Yeah, I know I died 60 years ago, but I've come back.
We have reanimated Dr. Naismith, and he's been kind enough to join us. For
I'm confused by the prevalence of jump shooting, but I think I'll figure it out.
There might be one other thing that Dr. Naismith would be very displeased with. We won't go there.
Maybe.
Anyway, let's get started here. So, like I said, we're looking at the next 24 players in line. Probably going to hear some names tonight that you may not know. That's kind of the point of this, to give some recognition maybe to some people that are either off the radar because they played too long ago and they just don't get the recognition that they deserve. Maybe they played in a different era and some of their stats maybe don't fit in the traditional sense of what makes a quote-unquote great player, right? There's a number of criteria. We have a lot of debates, right? We all work together, so we have debates in the office about some of these criteria that do make a good versus bad ball player. And it's going to be really interesting tonight to hear some of the perspectives of what you guys think should be, right, 8 apiece, but the next 24 players in line for the NBA's top 100, right? In 25 years, they'll do a list, and hopefully most of these guys are on it, right? Make us look like we know what we're talking about. So I'm going to start with the authority on all things basketball, Dr. Naismith. Who's your first pick here for somebody you want included on the NBA's top 100?
Well, I'm glad you took me first because I have the best available person that should have been on the 75 list to begin with. Some of these guys I think were on the fringe. I think this guy was clearly a top 75 player of all time. And I'm going to take Artis Gilmore, who y'all know I love.
And there's one off my list. Well done.
Thank you.
He was not on my list, so you're good.
Artis Gilmore was he's still alive, but was a 7'2", 240-pound center, which was massive at that time. He played, in the 70s primarily, and then into the 80s. He played a long time, actually. I think he's like top 20 all time in games played. Played a really long time. And for big guys, that can be tough for a lot of them to play that long. For his career, he averaged 18.8 points, 12 rebounds a game, 2.3 assists. He's got almost 190 win shares, which is a very, very high number and a lot higher than a lot of guys on the 75 list. He shot basically 60% from the field for his career,
which is the all-time best mark for field goal percentage.
Yeah, he's a incredibly efficient player, great rebounder, really good defensive player. I think the reason he didn't make the 75 team is because he played in the ABA at the beginning of his career. His first year in the ABA, he went 23 points, 17.8 rebounds, and 5 blocks a game.
Good.
For the Kentucky Colonels. Yeah, he was a pretty dominant force, and was actually when the ABA was dissolved and the NBA was able to draft guys. I've talked about this in Ryan's Corner a little bit. Artis Gilmore was like the guy, and Dr. J was an option, and they were like, we want Artis Gilmore. So Dr. J, even at that time, was not considered a better player than Artis Gilmore. Of course, they didn't really watch a lot of him, but great player, played forever, and he should have been on the list. ABA gets too much hate.
Yeah, for sure. I had a couple additional notes. One, the all-time leader in field goal percentage. So you mentioned it, the efficiency that he played with, the win shares that he brought to the table defensively as well. 6-time All-Star, 2-time All-Defense, and of course, as you mentioned, Ryan, he didn't play his whole career in the NBA. So for him to have those stats compiled, right, that recognition compiled in the NBA is a big deal for sure. Bentley, you got any thoughts on Mr. Gilmore here in Ryan's pick?
It's a good pick. Artis Gilmore, obviously a phenomenal basketball player. I think it's important to mention for the listening audience that Dr. Naismith is our resident historian here.
Absolutely.
But also to mention that basketball was first played in the year 1980, and anything prior to that is just a fallacy.
Well, that's good because Artis Gilmore played 8 seasons in the 80s.
That's why it's a good pick. That's what I'm saying. No, I mean, Artis Gilmore, obviously I know who Artis Gilmore is. He was a phenomenal player. So, yeah, I think he probably deserves a spot on the top 100.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know about 76, but, you know.
For sure. Well, let's stick in your corner there, Bentley. And speaking of corners, nice self-plug there, Ryan. I like it.
Yeah, there you go. With Ryan's corner action.
Thank you. Please watch I'm Lonely.
Check out Ryan's corner. Post it on the page. Bentley, who's your first pick here for top 100?
Sure. So this is a player that I think deserved to be on the top 75 list. I thought it was kind of a travesty that he was not included on it. That was kind of weird. I was looking for his name, and I was like, there's no way he's not on here. Like when it first released, right? Turns out he wasn't. So, NBA called me. We got some things to discuss. And like I mentioned, basketball started in 1980. So this guy is one of the most dominant players we've ever seen in the sport. Like, played 18 years, really 17 seasons. In the 2018-2019 season, he only played 9 games. It is none other than Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard was a career 16-12. His peak was much higher than that, though, the 16 points. Excuse me, on 60% career field goal shooting, which is very efficient, especially for a big man who really didn't ever develop an offensive game. Like, he didn't really have offensive moves. He was just so much more athletic and better than everyone. He led the NBA in rebounds 5 years. He led them in blocks twice, field goal percentage 1 time. He won a title, which is going to be a common theme, I think, going down the list for all of us. 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, 8-time All-Star, 8-time All-NBA player. He did it all on the defensive end for teams. Like he was an underrated perimeter guy because he was so athletic he could move and stick with guys, and then still defend the paint at the same time. Like the guy was a stud. I don't know why he wasn't on the top 75. He's going to be a Hall of Famer whenever he finally leaves. Well, can he get in the Hall of Fame while he's in China? I don't know how that works.
Yeah, okay. As long as he retired from the NBA.
Yeah, so he'll be in the Hall of Fame in like 2 years, 3 years, whatever his 5-year limit is up. Dwight Howard's my pick, and I stand by that.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit of a travesty that he didn't make the top 75. I wonder your opinion, and Ryan, you can chime in too after Bentley does, but how much does the way his career ended with kind of there's a little bit of controversy, there's a little bit of weirdness, there's a little bit of kind of toxicity potentially over some of the ways that things were handled, wasn't a real good media guy at times. How much do you think that has a bearing on why he doesn't get the credit he deserves as dominant player? His peak was unbelievable too.
Yeah. He beat LeBron in the playoffs in 2009 by himself. Basically, him and Hedo Turkoglu and Rashard Lewis dragged that team to the finals.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, whenever you're taking a poll, there's human bias involved, right? And like you said, like he wasn't always beloved by the media members. Every interaction, well, not that I've had with him, but every interaction that I've taken in from him in dealing with the media recently, like the last 5, 6, 7 years or whatever, has been positive, right? Like I can't think back to a time specifically when it's like, oh, Dwight Howard's the bad guy, right? Except for his Stan Van Gundy issue in Orlando, that was not great. where I think he was probably promised one thing by the organization, and then they turn around and did not do that in regards to his contract, and hence the move from Orlando to LA, like Shaq before him.
I was going to say it's sort of the same thing happened with Shaq too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They kind of alienated him going in a different direction. So it's probably safe to lean that direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, what do you think? Is that a big reason why he's not included and doesn't get the recognition he deserves?
Yeah, I mean, we were actually talking about the Football Hall of Fame today, and it reminds me of Terrell Owens.
Yep.
Terrell Owens is a top 5 receiver all time, more than like, especially modern receivers. If you get rid of like the old timey guys.
Yep.
Should have been first ballot.
Yep.
Shouldn't have been a question. It's like, we just don't like the cut of his jib, so we're not gonna vote for him. I mean, that's basically what happened.
Yep.
And Dwight Howard was nowhere near as bad as T.O. was. Right. I think what's weird about Dwight Howard and how people perceive him is I always thought he was a pretty likable guy in the media. Yeah. He was definitely like childish in a lot of ways, right? Like people viewed him that way, but that's just I don't think it was like in a bad way is what I mean. I think maybe that hurts him. Like he never was viewed as serious. Like he's not the Black Mamba gonna kill you kind of guy, right? But he was the best center in the league for years.
Yeah.
Like far and away, there was a lack of good centers, but that doesn't mean that takes anything away from him. Just statistically dominated. He carried teams like Bentley said. I actually had him as my number 1 guy that missed out on the 75 team. I have him in my top 40 all time. So I think it's a big snub.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge snub. And I do think a lot of it is personality, maybe the injuries sapping him, but like people just forgot his peak, and his peak was incredible. And, I've never seen anybody like that. Blake Griffin was that without the defense.
Yeah.
It's like add a all-time defender to Blake Griffin, and it's like that's one of the best players I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And that's basically what you got.
I still remember the dunk contest when he went at it with Nate Robinson, and he put a fucking sticker on the top of the backboard, and nobody knew it until like after the scores came out.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is one of the most unbelievably athletic, ridiculous things that you can do. You mentioned Terrell Owens, and it's similar to Curt Schilling, right, in Major League Baseball, right? He's been alienated by the media, and he's not going to get into the Hall of Fame. He may end up getting in with the Veterans Committee, but he didn't. I think he actually has now exhausted all of his chances to get in, if I remember correctly. Last year, I think, was his last chance. But same thing, though, right? All-time player during his era, he was one of the best. He's got the sock game. He's got all the moments. He helped win a World Series in 2 different cities, yada, yada. Yet he's alienated because he's not a nice guy. Right? Like that's sad. That's sad. I want to jump back to something that Bentley said, and you mentioned it also with the defensive and the athletic and the way he could play on the perimeter. I think offensively too, right? He never developed that kind of Kareem offensive game, but the fact that he could go out and be a real threat in the pick and roll in a lot more ways than a lot of guys are at his height, right? As athletic as he was, he could really threaten the defense in the pick and roll game. And I think that's what made both Hedo Turkoglu and Jameer Nelson as successful as they were in Orlando, because they were playing off of Dwight in terms of offensively.
If he would have ran the pick and roll slightly more, he might have been one of the greatest offensive centers of all time.
Yeah.
But he decided halfway through his peak that he's like, I'm a back to the basket guy. And he was like really inefficient, specifically with the Rockets. I want this to be known. Imagine Dwight Howard and a James Harden pick and roll over and over again. I mean, that would have been the best offense in the league, and it was already close to the best offense in the league with him backing people down.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I'm going to make my first pick here, and I'm going to go with a little bit of a throwback, and I'm going to go with a scoring machine. He had 4 straight years averaging 30-plus points, and that's Adrian Dantley. He's a Hall of Famer, 6-time All-Star, twice he won the scoring title, twice All-NBA, Rookie of the Year in 76, 77, played, I think it was 19 seasons, or 16 seasons. But like I mentioned, 4 straight years averaging 30. The year before that streak, he had averaged 28. The year after that, he averaged 26. Then he averages 30 again. I mean, he was just an unbelievable scoring machine on some of the highest scoring teams that have ever played, those Utah Jazz teams in the early 80s. Not a lot of recognition for winning a bunch. He played on some teams that didn't necessarily make those deep runs, but he also gets credited with helping John Stockton and Karl Malone kind of come into their own, right? Become what they became, mentored them early in their careers. I think he's a guy that if you ask basketball enthusiasts, they all know who he is, and they all know that he was just an automatic bucket. But I think it gets lost in the annals of the NBA, not on the voters, obviously, because he's in the Hall of Fame, but in the annals of the NBA in terms of talking about the all-time greats, because he didn't win a lot, right? And I think that he does kind of get a little bit of a shaft in terms of recognition long-term. But yeah, for me, Adrian Dantley's my first pick here. Just the ridiculous numbers that he put up, the awards that he was able to accrue, and obviously being inducted into the Hall of Fame are big separators for me. Ryan, what do you think? Dantley, yay, nay? I'm way off the mark here.
No, Dantley's on my list. I think, what is the hardest thing to do in the NBA? It's scoring, and that guy could do it with the best of them. He has even the advanced statistics that don't look like terrible. Yeah. Like his advanced stats look pretty good. He just gets flat because he didn't win a lot, right? He gets we brought him into Detroit, and it didn't do enough to get us there. He was always viewed as a pariah, not a great teammate. That was one of his problems. But yeah, I mean, he had 1, 2, 3, 4 straight seasons of 30 points per game. Obviously in the high scoring 80s with Utah, like you said, but still, you can't teach that. He should be recognized, whether he won or not.
Yeah, for sure. Bentley, any other thoughts?
It's a good pick. The dude was a monster. He could fill it up from well, I don't want to say from anywhere. He could fill it up on any given night, seemingly effortlessly, right? The dude was, like you said, he was a walking bucket.
Yep. All right, well, let's keep this train moving then. Ryan, who's your next pick here?
Oh man, I got a good one.
All right.
All right, you can be quiet. When it's your pick, you can talk. I'm going to take a guy who played second fiddle to another great, Bob Pettit. I'm going to take Cliff Hagan, who was a 6'4" small forward, which is a very small forward for the modern day, but he, of course, did not play in the modern era. First year was in 1956. He had a pretty good peak. He was like a 20-point per game guy, basically from 26 to 30. He did not start playing until he was 25 professionally, so his career was not, years-wise, is not super long. But those St. Louis Hawks teams with Clyde Leveillette and Bob Pettit and Cliff Hagan, obviously. Cliff Hagan was the second best player on that team, was a huge contributor to their championship, was a multi-time All-Star. And he has one of the great stories of all time. He played in the ABA. He retired from the NBA, and then the ABA started, and the Dallas Chaparrals hired him as a player coach, and he liked to put himself in the game.
Jackie Moon
at 36 years old, 36 to 38, and he regularly would fight people. That was he just liked to fight guys, and I just like the image of the coach putting himself in the game and then getting pushed on a rebound and just decking the guy. And especially a 6'4" guy in the late 60s where they were starting to get pretty big, some big dudes at that time. And there's a story where the owner of the Chaparrals, who was a very buttoned up business guy, was like, "Hey Cliff, I'm going to need you to stop fighting people because it looks bad. Dallas is we're a respectable Southern city kind of thing." And he was like, "Okay, I won't fight anymore." And he put himself in the next game, and he made it 14 seconds before he got into a fight and was ejected. So, You got to respect a guy who's got that type of hustle at 37 years old.
Absolutely.
And put up 18 points per game at 36 in the ABA, which is very impressive. And the other thing I want to say is he apparently was the only not super racist guy on the 1950 St. Louis Hawks who had 3 white stars. And he apparently was the only one who wasn't hard to deal with.
Good for him. Good for him.
Yeah, that's
not one that I had on my list, but I warned everybody when we started this podcast. There are going to be some names that you probably don't know, and our resident savant, our resident Rain Man of basketball, shed some light on some guys that. And look, it's hard to argue the stats. It's hard to argue the decoration, and it's hard to argue with a guy who was starting fights and scoring 18 points a game at the age of 37. So, Bentley, any thoughts here on Hagan?
He's a guy that I really just know by name.
Yep.
I wasn't, regularly flying out to St. Louis in the 60s to take in basketball games.
Would have been tough to get a flight.
It just wasn't in the cards for me at that point in my life. I wish I could have been there. Honestly, I would have loved to see that. But I'm gonna go with Dr. Naismith on this one and say that feels like probably a pretty good pick.
We're deferring to the doctor.
Yeah.
Bentley, who's your next pick here?
So I'm also gonna pick a small forward, but this guy's 6'8" and didn't play second fiddle to anybody because he's actually a good basketball player, unlike Ryan's pick, who was just an amateur UFC fighter apparently. This guy was, I think he was probably the first basketball player that I was actually infatuated by. And that's none other than number 1, Tracy McGrady. Everybody knows Tracy McGrady. Everybody loves Tracy McGrady. And I'm everyone. Tracy McGrady was career 26-4 on any given night on 44, 34, 75% shooting. He's in the Hall of Fame already. It's 7 All-Stars, 7 All-NBA teams, won the scoring title twice. And from the years 2000 to 2008, averaged no less than 20 points a game, including back-to-back years where he went 32 and then 28 points a game. We all know the famous clip of him scoring 13 points in 38 seconds or whatever it is. The only
knows that very intimately, I'm sure.
Yes, he does. Well, the only instance that you could say he might have played second fiddle to somebody on a basketball court was when he played with Yao Ming. Yao Ming was a great player, don't get me wrong, phenomenal basketball player, but I think Tracy McGrady was the best player on that team. Now he played less than 1,000 games in his career. He played like 984 or something like that. Injuries really derailed him, and it was a tragic thing really to watch that happen throughout his career. But for the time that he did play, he was, I don't know, one of the 4 or 5 best players in the league. Like, the dude was incredible. He could do everything on a basketball court, and he was huge. He was 6'8". He's the same height as LeBron. He was probably a little more slender in stature, but that didn't stop him from being an absolute bucket and doing anything he wanted to offensively on a basketball court.
Yeah, for sure. And, you mentioned never playing second fiddle. I mean, he started his career with a guy who would go on to be incredibly famous for dunk contests, who might not even have been the best dunker on those Raptors teams. McGrady was sneaky and just filthy athletic. And he had – I saw a breakdown one time that he had the perfect basketball body. He had long legs, a short upper torso, and his arms hung below his knees, like his fingertips were below his knees. And I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was one of the Talking Heads, former coach on ESPN or one of the other networks, that was talking about the fact that that allowed him a lot of things, right? He could cover a lot of ground, he could cover a lot of space, right, with his wingspan, et cetera, et cetera. So Tracy McGrady was one of my favorite players to ever watch. I know for a fact, my buddy who's a big Magic fan, it's his favorite player of all time. And he was just disgusting to watch him, the way he could just do. And Kobe Bryant has even said, if Tracy McGrady had a better work ethic, he might have been the best player ever, right? You could never get him in the gym. You could never get him to take his craft seriously, that sort of thing. And to be as good, as productive, and to be a Hall of Famer with that knock on your resume, just imagine how good he could have been, right? Ryan, what are your thoughts? I saved you for last year because you're the Rockets fan, and you got to see some of his best performances there when he was playing with Yao Ming.
Yeah, I think, I love McGrady. That was my middle school to high school years, right? It's my formative years watching basketball. The Jeff Van Gundy, Rick Adelman, Rockets teams. I think McGrady was the best player on those teams. I agree with Bentley. That was definitely a two-headed monster, but McGrady was clearing away. They unfortunately could never stay healthy together, as I've talked about a million times. I think they were probably a top 2 or 3 team in the league when they were healthy. They just couldn't do it. But both dealt with those injuries. I think the saddest part of what I saw of McGrady, what I remember as a Rockets fan, obviously I saw some of his Orlando stuff, but I was pretty young, is watching his body breakdown was really sad. Especially his back. Your back is so tough, right? It's so hard to come back. Even just back spasms, it's like, oh, that doesn't sound that bad. It's like, nah, it's debilitating. And they're giving him shots. And it's like, you can play, and that just shortens his career, right? And I think that's really sad because I think at that point he had really figured the game out.
Yeah.
Like he knew how to do what he could do and how he was most effective. He wasn't throwing the ball off the backboard and dunking it anymore, which was incredible that he ever could do that.
Yeah.
But he was not doing that anymore.
In a live game.
Yeah. And he was still killing people. So if his back didn't break down, those years I think would have had insane numbers from just a totality of points and stuff. And could do a lot, could pass the ball. He was a decent defender. I think he got snubbed for the 75 for sure. He's right on the edge. I think probably a better player than the Lillards, those types of guys. But yeah, he should definitely be in this list, 100%.
For sure. Excellent. So Ryan, I'm actually going to go to your well for my next pick, and I'm going to shout out Ryan's Corner as well. You've done a profile on this player. He has one of the best stories. You mentioned a lot of the backstory on him. I won't reiterate a lot of that, but Alex English, Nuggets all-timer, Hall of Famer, 8-time All-Star, won a scoring title, 3 times All-NBA, 21, 5, and 4 for his career. Very, very good scorer. Win shares over 100, shot over 50%. He just filled it up and played an important role for those Nuggets teams during a time that maybe they were kind of up and down. But I believe they won one title? No, they didn't. No, they didn't even make a final. That's right. They won their first title this year. I don't know why I thought. I'm probably thinking of another player, so that's my bad. But averaged 25 over 25 points for 7 straight years, and his scoring title, he scored over 28 points the year he won the title there. Overall, I just think Alex English is a guy that I don't know how, but he gets overlooked in terms of recognition by the greater kind of NBA body. It might be some of the same reasons that like an Adrian Dantley gets overlooked. Not a lot of playoff, not a lot of success on the main stage. Played in Denver, kind of west of the Mississippi, where TV coverage, especially during the time that he played, a lot of media coverage didn't necessarily move out west. And it always had that East Coast bias, right? It's always been kind of pitched that way. But Adrian Dantley, Alex English, a guy that I think probably deserved to be in the top 75. Maybe I don't know who I would knock out for a couple of these guys we've talked about. It'd have to be.
I do.
Yeah, I bet you do. But I think he's a top probably 50 to 60 player of all time. Certainly should have been in the top 75. I'm going to save you for last, Ryan, since you already did a profile on him. I know you're going to have some good stuff for us. Bentley, what are your thoughts here on Alex English?
I like to pick. He's on my list as well. He's on my short list. He's a Hall of Famer. Tough to leave a Hall of Famer off your top 75, but I guess they found a way to do that.
Yeah. Ryan, how many Hall of Famers are there? I know you know.
Players.
Yes.
I think there's like close to 200 now. I think there's like 168 that I know of, but I think there's like 200 with like some of the fringe, like this guy invented the jump shot kind of thing.
Influencers of the game.
Yeah, and then like Wayne Embry is in the Hall of Fame. He was like a player for a long time, but is in as a contributor. I've talked about this. There's actually way more than 200 if you include coaches and contributors.
Sure.
But I think it's like 165 to 200, somewhere in that range.
Interesting. So it does get a little slim pickings, huh?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Ryan? Alex English, talk to me, bud.
Well, I know everyone that watches this pod also watched Ryan's Corner, so I don't really need to get too much into it. There's a clear audience crossover. Yeah, I mean, Alex English, I like the flow you're going Adrian Dantley and then Alex English. The same player. A lot of people look at their careers, very similar, right?
Yeah.
Alex English had a better team success than Adrian Dantley did, at least in the peak of his career. Those Denver teams were good teams. They just never won a championship. They were competitive. They made it to the conference finals once. Why does he get the hate that he does? I talked about this before, but the pace of that team was really high. They had one of the highest paces in the league. It was like them and the Showtime Lakers were running everybody off the floor. And also in the altitude in Denver, they were running people, right? What is funny about those teams is they were not a good fast break team. They actually were below average league wide almost every year in the 80s for fast break points. Everyone's like, oh, they score so many points off the steals, but they really didn't. They just shot really quickly. They took a lot of not jumpers, but a lot of shots.
More D'Antoni like.
Yeah, I mean, Doug Moe really revolutionized that type of team and kind of the free flowing offense. Alex English had a beautiful game. It was not flashy. It hit you with the turnaround jumper over and over again from the mid range, and that was the 80s. And he would just do it to 30 points a game. And that's probably hurts him too, is that he's not very flashy, right? Like Dantley, same thing. Like Dantley would kill you, but it was it's like watching Durant, and to some extent, right? Like Durant looks really easy.
Yep.
Durant is more athletic than both those guys, but sometimes you watch Durant in the mid range and you're like, whatever. He just hits 60% of those, no big deal. It just looks easy, and you just ignore the fact that it's incredibly efficient. And but yeah, watch my talk about him in Ryan's Corner if you want to see more. He's an interesting guy. I know Bentley watched it, and I know Gary watched it because I forced him to. Yeah, great pick. He was on my list as well, obviously.
All right, well, Ryan, it's on you. Who's your next pick?
Well, I like big guys, as y'all know. I'm a big fan of the big man. And I'm going to take Bob Lanier, who I think is a snub, again, for the 75 team. At the end of this pod, I can complain about the guys I don't think that should be on the 75 team if we really want to get into it. But Bob Lanier, Detroit legend, played pretty much his whole peak in Detroit from basically the beginning of the 70s till the end of the 70s. He probably is overshadowed by the Kareems of the world from that era, right? Obviously, he's not Kareem. But from 1971 to 1979, pretty much the whole 70s, he averaged 24 points, 12 and a half rebounds, 3.5 assists, which is pretty impressive for a 7-footer, and 2 blocks a game and a steal a game. He's getting 3 stocks a game. The man could play. They also didn't record blocks for the first 3 seasons of his career, so he probably had even more than that. Just a dominant interior presence. He just doesn't get the love because of the lack of the championships. Kareem's around at the same time, right? It's the era of the big man. He just happens to be right on the outside looking in. But cumulatively, his PER is great. He's got 117 win shares. I mean, the guy's got to be in the conversation if he's not already on the list. So.
Yeah, for sure. Good pick. I don't have anything to add that you didn't. It's unbelievable the stats that he has that he just gets overlooked, right? 20 and 12 in an era of the big man, right? To be able to put that up, that's incredibly impressive, and it is odd to think that he gets overlooked. Bentley, what are your thoughts here on old Bobby?
Old Bobby Detroit, Bobby D. He was truly a great player. It's unfortunate that that basketball didn't start earlier, or else you would have been recognized that way. The 1980 threshold really cut off there.
He averaged 20 and 12 before the NBA started.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
That's
he's
even
just
more
out there.
impressive.
He's just out there in the Detroit version of Rucker Park, putting up buckets, dude. Like, I'm shocked they have stats on that guy, to be honest. No, it's a wonderful pick. He should have been on my list. I'm a little ashamed that he's not.
I missed him too. I just think that it's a shame that he gets overlooked the way he does, and by me as well. Bentley, let's stick in your corner there, bud. Who's your next pick?
So this one, you guys may not think similarly to me on this pick, and that's okay. You guys have been wrong before. I'm sure you'll be wrong again. This is a player that I know everybody listening and watching to this podcast knows because we've talked about him a lot on this podcast. I'm going to slide Nikola Jokic in right here.
I thought he was going to be Mark Williams. I won't lie.
No, he's my next pick, actually. Shout out, Mark. So we talked during the finals about where this guy kind of slots all time, right? And a common theme in that discussion we had was longevity. Now, this guy doesn't have the longevity. Obviously, he's only been in the league like 7 years, I think. But to me, watching him play the way that he does and be able to do the things that he can do on a basketball court with the size that he has, he would have been a great player in any era in the NBA. And I think that is important, right, for this particular topic. 5 All-Star teams, 5 All-NBAs, the back-to-back MVPs, the title that came this year. His career numbers are 20, 10, and 7 on 55, 35, 83. From a 7-foot big man, that's insane. I imagine those numbers will continue to – excuse me, I'm very burpy today. I imagine those numbers will continue to go up, those averages, right? Because his first couple seasons really drug down his overall numbers. But, like, he could legitimately finish his career averaging a triple-double. Now, I don't think that will happen, but it's possible. And to think of that, like, that's just insane, right? Like, that guy is easily, in my opinion, a top 100, probably top 50 basketball player right now of all time without the next 8-10 years of his career that we haven't seen.
Yeah, this is a slam dunk for me, especially if you're projecting, right? I think when all is said and done, Nikola Jokic could be a top 10 guy of all time, maybe even a little higher. If he continues with the numbers he put up like the last 3-4 seasons, he is a back-to-back MVP and legitimately has an argument to have been a back-to-back-to-back MVP.
Yeah.
He averaged almost a triple, right? If you round up his assists this year, he averaged a triple-double. He's a center, but it's truly like a point center, and his vision, his court vision, his facilitation, his unselfishness, right? He's a guy that he scored 45 points in the playoffs and they lost. He's like, I just don't fucking care, right? I just want to win. And comes out the next game and he's getting guys involved early, ends up with 18 assists and yada. And that's not what you normally see from, these superstar types. And I think that's what eventually is likely going to propel him into like the top 10. He already has 100 fucking win shares. He's 8 seasons in. He's got 95, right? But I'm calling it 100 because it's ridiculous. 8 seasons, he's got almost 100 win shares, averaging nearly 12 win shares a game. Or a season, sorry. Yeah, a game, that'd be fucking crazy. And it's not, right, you think about too, right, all those numbers are nice because they're really like flashy because they're offensive numbers. He's a really good defender, right? He's not above the rim guy who's going to go up and swat you into the third row, but he's going to be in the right place where he needs to be on time, in position, and he's going to be a really good help and communicate with his teammates. So for me, I don't think there's any criticism to be made about Nikola already being in the top probably 50, maybe 75 of all time with what he's done in 8 seasons. And I have no reservations about saying that I think he's going to be a top 10 guy by the time he's done. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Joker?
Yeah, I think if he retired right now, he'd be on the list. he doesn't need to do anything else, and he's going to do at least something else. So yeah, I mean, there's not much to say. He, from a strictly resume perspective, is an easy choice. So
yeah, I mean, he rounded it out with a Finals MVP and a championship, right? So yeah, for sure. All right. Well, next on my list, I'm gonna go with a more modern guy than I have with my first couple of picks. But I'm gonna go with another guy that I think doesn't get as much credit as he probably should for a dynastic run. Probably the last real dynasty that we've seen. You could probably make some arguments that we might be watching the beginnings of a dynasty with Denver, potentially, with the way they've got guys locked up. But the point guard of the San Antonio Spurs dynasty run, Tony Parker, for me, if we're going top 100, I don't know that I'm going to try to make an argument that he should have been in the top 75 like some of the other guys, but definitely if we're going top 100, this guy has to be, right? Career 15, 3 rebounds, really been 6, but really what it comes down to is how much he contributed to the game, and I think that is reflected in his efficiency ratings. He's got 111 win shares for his career. 6-time All-Star, 4 championships, 4-time All-NBA, won a Finals MVP. Yeah, he also in the Hall of Fame for Ladies He's Bagged, for sure. At his peak, what's that?
Sways voters.
Yes, absolutely. But at his peak, there weren't many point guards in the NBA that you would want running your team over him. Didn't put up gaudy assist numbers, but I think that had a lot to do with kind of how the Spurs offense ran. It was not this high-paced, we're going to try to outscore you, and everybody's moving around, ball movement. We've got a guy who's facilitating. He was a guy who ran that offense in the way that it needed to be run in Pop's scheme, and he fit it so perfectly. And I know, right, Duncan's obviously the guy we're going to talk about as maybe the best power forward of all time, right? Obviously the most important piece of that dynastic run, but I don't think that they become that level of dynasty without a guy running the show like Tony Parker. Ryan, what are your thoughts? Tony Parker here. Am I off base?
I watched a lot of Tony Parker as they played the Rockets a lot. Yep. He was pretty good. He is somebody that, Gary, I think he did a good job with this. You really got to contextualize his career because the stats are maybe right on the fringe of this conversation, right? You have to contextualize the way San Antonio plays. You have to contextualize who was around him. There is a fair argument that he was a better player than his stats show, and that he was a better team player because of that, right? He was willing to do those things. And I think those are things, that you're really mixing it up here because you took 2 guys who arguably were hated on because they weren't team players. And now you take a guy who's a pretty well-known team player in that Spurs system. But yeah, I think he's a guy that definitely needs to be in this conversation. He was on my initial 45-person list to make the 24 people here. So he was in the conversation. I don't have a problem with it. I think his problem is going to be, from a historical perspective, is the contextualization and trying to maintain that contextual. Because in 30 years, people aren't going to remember Popovich and Duncan like that play style and Ginobili. It's going to be different. I mean, Duncan already gets hated on. So,
yep.
Bentley.
Yeah. TP was on my short list as well. I can remember, I believe it was the first finals against the Miami Heat, and Pop ran him out there to play defense against LeBron, like man-to-man defense against LeBron, like as a point guard.
Yeah.
What are we doing here? But you know what? It fucking worked. Like, they won that title. So I was a big Tony Parker fan. I thought that he played the game in a way that benefited his team so much more than it benefited himself. And I really value players like that, regardless of numbers, right? So I was a really big Tony Parker fan. I love the pick. I think he definitely deserves to be in the conversation, if not for sure on the list of top 100.
All right. Ryan, your way. Who's your next pick?
All right, I'm gonna take a guy. We talked about Jokic earlier. I'm gonna talk, and we talked about Alex English, but I'm gonna take an even older Denver legend. And Denver's not that old, so there's not a lot of space left to go here.
You're fitting into that small window before 1970.
Is it Jeff Green?
Yeah, his rookie year in 1968. I'm going to take Daniel Paul Issel, Dan Issel, more famously known. His stats are pretty crazy. He is another guy who everyone who listens to me talk about basketball listens to me talk about the ABA. He's another guy who gets a lot of hate because he played in the ABA for the majority of his prime. But I just have his. So he joins the NBA at 28 years old, having played most of, again, his prime in the ABA. He averages in the NBA 20.4 points, 8 rebounds, 2.5 assists, and a steal a game from the age of 28 to 36. Pretty impressive stats. He's like 20th all time in points total. He's second all time in ABA points. He was super dominant in the ABA. And in case people forget, Dr. J played in the ABA. Moses Malone. These are guys. It's not like they had pushovers, all over the league. He won one championship, I believe, in the ABA. Yeah, one championship in the ABA, and really was that bridge from Denver coming into the NBA until you get into like the Alex English era. They played together for a little while at the end of Issel's career and beginning of or middle of Alex's career. He was that transitional period, really the first great Nuggets legend. And doesn't get the love that he deserves for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that's who I got.
Good pick, and I love the context too, right? You talk about his exploits in the ABA and some of the guys that were in the ABA who he kind of dwarfed with his production, right? Bentley, what are your thoughts here on old Dan Issel?
I just think that I should get some credit for this pick from Ryan, because I was there whenever Ryan said, man, I should really put Dan Issel on this list. So I would like to take partial credit for Ryan picking Dan Issel here. It helps to bolster my list because I don't have players as old as Ryan does. No, Dan Issel, for those that watched basketball prior to 1980, was a superstar and a legend of the game. And he's not on my list, but obviously the case is there to be made if we're doing a basketball list rather than an NBA list of the best basketball players, the 100 best basketball players of all time.
For sure. All right, Bentley, who's your next?
So we've talked about Tony Parker being a great Spur, so I figured I'd just stay in the same city, and I'm going to take Pau Gasol here. Most people remember him as a Laker, which as they probably should. Pau Gasol played 20 years in the NBA.
Yeah, he did.
That's tough to do as a guy that large, right? Career numbers 17-9-3 on 50, 37, 75. That's pretty efficient from pretty much everywhere on the court. Like 35% as a big man. That's really freaking good from downtown, right? He made 6 All-Star teams, 4 All-NBA teams, and won 2 titles. Those are just numbers that signify to me that you're a really, really, really freaking good basketball player, and you did it for 20 years. He was one of the, I hesitate to say first superstars from overseas. He was one of the most important players from overseas because he was so freaking good in the NBA. I think that he played a role in the globalization of basketball. And I think that being able to carry that mantle to bring the game to the rest of the globe while still being as dominant as you are in the NBA is very important. So for that reason, as well as all of the numbers and winning that he did, I would like to put him on my top 100 list.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the international piece, right? Those Olympic teams, those FIBA teams that he captained and led, competed against the U.S. and so much to the point that there's a famous clip where LeBron is narrating Kobe before the game where they're playing Spain, and he's like, "I'm going through Pau's chest on the first play of the game to set the tone," right? And that's his fucking teammate in LA, right? At the time, not just they had played together in LA, they were literally on the same team in LA at the time of said transaction, right? In first play of the game, and that was how important Pau was to that team. But that team was so important on the international stage because, as you mentioned, right, Bentley, it was kind of the awakening, right? Those French teams, those Spanish teams of that time were kind of the awakening of, okay, we got some competition on the international stage, because since the Dream Team, we had really just dominated the international stage, and it wasn't close, right? Yeah. And then those were the times when some of those guys were coming to the NBA, but also when they were competing in those international competitions, and Pau was a big part of that. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Pau?
Yeah, I'm always happy to get a great Houston Rocket on the list. Anyone remembers the famous Chris Paul to the Lakers trade? Pau Gasol went to the Rockets in that trade. They both had great careers there, and nothing stopped that trade from happening.
No, nothing at all.
One of the great butterfly effects of the league, him being a part of that trade, just from a historical perspective. But Pau was great. Yeah. I remember him in Memphis because we played him a lot. Houston played him all the time, right? And he used to kill us. Like, Yao would guard him, and I was like, well, he's not going to shoot, with Yao all over him. He had the quickness at his size to go past guys that were bigger than him. He had enough size and strength to handle power forwards. He was one of the last bastions of the power forwards of those eras, right? That were still like not super rangy, but had enough skill to do a lot of different things. But they're not like today where they're 6'7" and shoot threes. So yeah, I mean, it was just a dominant offensive force, and then a great part of the triangle offense that the Lakers ran. With Lamar Odom and Kobe and those guys. Just a great pick. I think he should definitely be on this for sure.
Yeah, and one other piece too, right? With a guy like a steady guy, right? He's kind of the model of consistency for the first 12, 15, 13 years of his career, because between 2001 and 2014-15, there was only one season where he averaged outside of the range of 17 to 21 points. And there was only one season where he averaged outside of the 7 to 11 rebounds. So he was the model of consistency for several teams. He played for 4 teams, I believe, during that time frame. So he was the model of consistency. You could rely on him night in and night out, and absolutely one of the 100 best to ever do it.
Was Ryan mentioned earlier the trade that didn't go through, obviously. Was Chris Paul, was he a better Laker or a Wizard?
Probably a Wizard, I would say.
Probably, yeah. Okay, all right.
Spent the exact same amount of time in both places.
I think that was a bad trade for the Lakers. I just want that to be thrown out. Losing Lamar Odom and Pau Gasol to get Chris Paul next to Kobe, I don't like that team that much.
Andrew Bynum still would have been there, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, but losing your 2 forwards, that I don't know.
Tough.
Guess we'll never know.
What's that?
Said, I guess we'll never know.
We'll never know.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna go back to the well here. Some older names, but
yes.
My next my next pick here, a guy who averaged 22 points for his career, played on 5 different teams, but Hall of Famer, 4-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA, won a scoring title in 1984-85. Bernard King, guy who I personally don't think gets enough recognition for who he was for some teams that maybe didn't appreciate who he was. Knicks legend, really. Led the league in scoring in 1984-85 with 33 points a game. Could contribute in every way, really. Had half a block a season for most of his career, but averaged over a steal also for the bulk of his career. I really like Bernard King in terms of, what he means kind of in the history of the game, but curious to hear your thoughts here. I thought this might be one that was maybe a borderline outlier. Curious. I'm going to save you for last, Ryan. Bentley, what are your thoughts on Bernard King?
It started to make me sound like I don't know what I'm talking about, which is very true. I mean, it's an honest thing. So
saving the historian for
but Bernard King, I did not have on my list. Not because he's not a great player, right? Like he was really good at the game of basketball. I didn't think he won as much as I would like for someone on this list to win. That's really that's really the only thing I have to say about it, right? Like there's nothing that I can stack his numbers up against to say that he's not deserved of being mentioned as a great player, right? But like we're kind of picking nits here with 100 best ever. And it's like, well, if you don't really win that much, were you really that great? That's kind of my only thought about it. I don't really have an issue. It's just kind of picking nits.
Yeah, I think the only counterpoint there in terms of the idea of not winning a lot is his player efficiency rating is very counter to his win shares is like 75 because he was on some really bad teams that just didn't win, but his player efficiency rating is right around 20, and so that'd be if I were to make a counterpoint to not winning and being able to be on this list, I would say that he was a very efficient, very solid player for a long time. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Bernard King?
Yeah, he's really tough, right? He is in this conversation. I had him on my list of very large number of players. What's interesting about him, I think, is his comeback from his knee injury that pretty much no one did at that time. His injury was a career-ending injury. He tore his ACL. I think he broke one of his leg bones, tore the cartilage in his knee. In 1985, you were done. I'm not giving him all the credit. Obviously, there's medical advancements, but he came back from that and had a couple good seasons after that, one comeback player of the year. But yeah, I mean, he had 32 point per game season, even all the way into the late stages of his career playing for the Washington Bullets. He was putting up points. He had a 28 point per game season. Yeah, playing with my boy Purvis Ellison with the Washington Bullets. I think he's one of the great scorers. I really like your methodology you're going with here, going for guys who didn't win but scored a lot. Because like I said, that's the hardest thing to do in the game. And it's the thing that Kevin Durant always says, they don't pay me to play defense. Not that he's not a bad defender. He doesn't apparently get paid for it.
Yeah, right. A little more willing than some guys, some of his peers.
Had him on my list.
Ryan, who's your
Durant's on your list?
Who's your next pick here, Ryan?
All right, I'm glad you've taken Bernard King because I'm going to take a guy who has no longevity, who had one of the brightest early careers of all time, one of the great nicknames, one of the greatest dunkers of all time, David Skywalker Thompson, and also another great Denver Nugget.
There's a theme here.
Yeah.
Give me the key to the city, boys. David Thompson. I mean, in his peak, an absolutely dominant offensive force. He has a 73-point game. There's not a lot of guys who have ever scored half that. And he did it in one game. And lost the scoring title to George Gervin that year when George Gervin scored like 60 points that same night. That was the last game of the season. It's a very famous story. Yep. His first 3 years, he did 26, 25.9, 27.2. One of those years in the ABA, but the next 2 years in the NBA, and then 24, 21, 25. He's 26 years old at that point. His career is basically over. He plays till he's 29, but his career is over due to cocaine use, heavy cocaine use, which was rampant at the time. And soon after his career is over, after the 1984 season, there was a ton of people who were suspended permanently because of cocaine use. He basically would have been out of the league. Andrew Wiggins' dad was suspended, Mitchell Wiggins, John Lucas, lots of guys just gone, right? It was a huge issue. Michael Jordan once said he modeled his game after David Thompson. When arguably the greatest player of all time says he modeled his game after you, we have to have a conversation that his peak was as good as anybody's scoring the ball. And yeah, I want to give him some recognition here and put him on this list. I think it's fair to criticize the longevity because he didn't even make it to his 30s. He was done at 29 years old. But it doesn't get much better than those first couple of years.
Yeah, he's like the Gale Sayers,
Yep.
Terrell Davis, yada yada, right? Those guys that had
Alfred
meteoric.
Morris.
What's that?
Alfred Morris.
Yeah, Elmo, who had meteoric starts to their career and injury or drug use in this case. But yeah, all NBA nickname team, absolutely Skywalker. Maybe one of the more fun ones, and maybe it's just Air because it's Air Jordan is the only other one that is maybe more recognizable, right? So good pick. And yeah, I like your justification, right? We're talking a lot of times you get on these lists, you get in Hall of Fame conversation, and it's always, well, how long did he do? How many times did he do? How many titles did they win? Those sorts of things. And sometimes you just got to take a step back and say, was he one of the best players when he played the game? And when Michael Jordan, you mentioned it, right? When Michael Jordan says, I modeled my game after that guy, he was doing something right. Bentley, what are your thoughts here on Skywalker?
I love the pick. I have him on my list of honorable mentions. He didn't make my short list just because of the longevity thing. But I have no issue with it. When he was at his peak, he was absolutely deserving of being at the top 100.
Yeah. Who's your next pick, Bentley?
So I'm going to pick another player that I think a lot of people know, and longevity probably will become a thing here. His less so due to drug use, more so due to medical conditions beyond his control. This is a player who, similar to Tracy McGrady, was drafted to Toronto and then left for greener pastures. I'm picking Chris Bosh here. Chris Bosh, I loved Chris Bosh when he played. He was one of the most efficient stretch fours, like that. He was in the era where the stretch four kind of developed into a five, right? Like now when he went to Miami, at least he still played with a five on the court. But when that team was at its best, he was playing the five, and they had Wade, Bosh, Braun, and then unfortunately Mario Chalmers and probably Mike Miller out there on the court, and Ray Allen too at times, obviously. Chris Bosh though, 19-9-2 for his career, on 50, 34, 80. That's really freaking good. He's a Hall of Famer. He made 11 All-Star teams. He did only make one All-NBA team, but I think that had he not gone to Miami, he would have made more because he did take the biggest kind of step back in production when he went to Miami. So his career numbers probably would have been higher as well if he had stayed in Toronto and kind of carried that team by himself. But again, like I mentioned earlier, I like guys to play the game to benefit the team more so than to benefit themselves. And he kind of embodied that when he took that role with those other guys in Miami. I just really like Chris Bosh. I was a big fan of his game. I thought he was a lot of fun to watch, especially when he was young and just kind of wild out there on the basketball court. Give me Chris Bosh, Hall of Famer, put him in the top 100.
I like the context there that you finished with, right? He took a step back, took probably the biggest backseat in Miami, and probably could have had some gaudy numbers continuing in Toronto because he was putting up gaudy numbers before he left for Miami. I will say this too. I don't know what it is, but I love watching lefties play the game of basketball. Guys like Chris Mullin and Chris Bosh and yada yada. Lefties just, there's something unique about it, more so than even watching like crafty lefties work on the mound in baseball. It's really just intriguing to me sometimes to watch a skilled basketball player work with his left hand the way that that lefties do. So Bosch has got that in his corner when it comes to my thoughts as well. Ryan, what do you think about Chris Bosch here? Hey, Dad, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, I like the Chris Bosch pick. He was on my list. Bentley knows he was on my list. Yeah, I think Bentley did a great job talking about sacrificing to win championships. I think that really says a lot about him as a player. It is really sad his career ended as early as it did. He did get to start at 19, so at least he has a more longevity than a lot of guys whose career ended that early. But I think he'd done it like 31, I believe.
He played 13 seasons, though.
Yeah, he played a long time for having his career end so short. Yeah. For age at least. But again, only playing 1 year at Georgia Tech, he came out right away.
Yep.
I think if he stays in Toronto, I completely agree. He probably multiple time All NBA team, right? Especially if he's playing the 4. There was an argument he was the best 4 in the league at that time. He changed the game. He also has one of the great quotes about the modern NBA where he said, "These guys were coming in doing step backs. I didn't even know what that was till my 5th year in the league." Which really shows that the game was starting to pass him by maybe a little bit. But yeah, I mean, the great stretch offense, could handle the ball, could pass, could defend the rim a little bit, had a lot of length, not a lot of power, but a lot of length. And really the great compliment to Wade and LeBron in Miami, but was a beast in Toronto when he was by himself doing his thing. So, yeah, I think he's got to be in the conversation for sure.
Yeah, I have to mention, too, looking at his basketball reference page, because he was on my list. I was looking at him earlier. I made a note of the fact that they have the Bostrich listed as one of his nicknames, which I never heard anybody call him, but it is a pretty cool nickname because of, obviously, right, he's kind of tall, lanky, bit of a long neck, that sort of thing. It kind of fits, but I never heard anybody call him that. I thought that was pretty cool.
That sounds like one of those edits where they're like, this is going to be funny if we put this on here. You know, like they do with Mike Trout. They put like fake nicknames on his page.
Yeah.
just to like troll people that look at it. I've never heard anyone call him that, but it is a good nickname.
Yeah, me neither. All right. I'm tossed up between a couple of guys that are kind of on my fringe, and I'm gonna get one in here, I think, before some of the guys that I've saved kind of toward the end. I'm gonna get maybe one of the great nicknames again. In it's so simple, right? But I just love when guys have the nickname Sweet, especially when it's Sweet Lou.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with a Atlanta Hawks, not Houston Rockets, other red team. Atlanta Hawks legend, Sweet Lou Hudson, Hall of Famer, 6-time All-Star, made an All-NBA team, 18,000 career points. Really kind of steady across his first 10 years in the league. Averaged right around 20 points a game the entire time there. 5.5 rebounds or so. Another guy that not a lot of success in terms of wins. Maybe I am sticking to kind of a pattern here, but career almost 50% shooter. That's for me. Sweet Lou Hudson, a guy that's kind of off the beaten path a little bit, but one of the guys that was the really consistent scorer across, a dozen or so seasons, 11 actually full seasons, 18,000 points for his career, though. That really stuck out to me. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Lou Hudson?
Yeah, Lou Hudson is an interesting choice. He's a really underrated guy from his era. But could score. I mean, he could score with the best of them. I think he got into the Hall of Fame really late. Unfortunately for him, he deserved it a lot earlier. He just played, I think, in an era where there were stars that just overshadowed him a lot. Right, again in the Kareem era, early Kareem, end of Oscar Robertson's career. Like Jerry West is still hanging around, Wilt Chamberlain's still around. Like people are like, I don't know who Lou Hudson is. Which was fine. But the guy could play. Like you said, 12 years, dominant offensive force. He has kind of an interesting tale when he played with Pete Maravich in the Hawks. Pete Maravich, as many people may know, was a slightly flashy player, and Lou Hudson did not like that. And Lou Hudson was like, I take one dribble and I shoot and it goes in. We don't need to do all the behind the back passing and stuff like that. And I respect that about him because Pistol Pete was one of the biggest names and probably they thought was the future in Atlanta. And guess who stayed in Atlanta / St. Louis? And guess who didn't? Pete Maravich is gone and Lou Hudson's there, right? So that just shows the kind of player he was. I think my only complaint is I wish he did a little bit more outside of scoring, but I can't disagree with your methodology. This guy's got to be in your grouping of firebrand scores. I'd probably have him just outside the top 100, but not by a lot. He would have been on my list of honorable mentions.
Bentley, any thoughts?
So I think it was Shaq. Could potentially have been Charles Barkley, but he doesn't really apologize for anything. So it probably was Shaq. One time on Twitter, he had made a comment on the Inside the NBA show, and then somebody tweeted him a video clip, and Shaq quote tweeted, he goes, "I'm sorry, son, I wasn't familiar with your work." That's kind of where I'm at this point in the conversation about Sweet Lou. Obviously, I know the name. I can tell you who he played for or whatever. I did, similar to the St. Louis games that I missed because I couldn't catch my flight in time. The train would always leave the station right as I was rolling up to get to Atlanta to go down and watch these games. I just couldn't see it in person, so I can't really speak to the effectiveness of his scoring levels. But I'll take your word for it, and I'll put him 101st on my list of top 100 basketball players.
I appreciate that. The other point I had in my notes that I didn't mention is that his jersey's in the rafters there.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, another one in his corner. And Ryan mentioned the Pistol Pete point too, with one got ran out of town and one didn't, and one's considered an all-time NBA legend, and the one who stayed in town is overlooked, which is weird. But anyway, Ryan, who's your next pick?
I just want to say Lou Hudson was on my list to do for Ryan's Corner because I thought he is a guy who is not brought up. I actually was looking at his card as you were talking, and it's just him getting ready to take a jumper like this. And I'm like, yep, that's him.
That's him.
One dribble and pull up.
Yeah, he that's how they played back then, and he was really good at it. He probably will end up being on there at some point. I have a long list of who I want to do, but my guy, another forgotten big, we seem to all have our MOs. Bentley is post 2001 players. Gary is firebrand scores, and mine are the big man of the ancient days and David Thompson.
So we're covering bases here. We're covering bases. So you're going to get a complete list, just not from any one of us.
Yeah, to be fair, I did have Alex English on my list, so
yeah,
I really reached back for that one.
Yeah, you did. That's as far back as you go. I'm going to take Walt Bellamy.
On my list.
Oh, my God. This is a miracle. Chicago Zephyrs legend, Walt Bellamy.
The Zephyrs.
Yeah, or the Chicago Packers, depending on what year you're talking about. I actually had this conversation with Bentley yesterday talking about Walt Bellamy because I just randomly talk about Walt Bellamy on Wednesdays typically. And I was like, yeah, he played for the Packers and the Zephyrs and the Bullets because that's the same team.
Yeah.
And he was like, what is a Zephyr? And I was like, I don't know. I've read it one time, but I forgot. And I'll have you know, a Zephyr is a gentle wind. The Chicago gentle winds. I guess Windy City is kind of what they were thinking, but Walt Bellamy typifies the gentle wind to a tune of 31 points and 19 rebounds in his first year in the league. Just an absolute dominant force in the 60s. His problem is he played at the exact same time as Wilt Chamberlain. Some people might have heard of him. And then the second half of his career was not nearly as good as the first half. He was probably the second or third best center in the league for half his career from 22 to 29 years old. Dominant force, Bullets legends, Knicks legend, like I said, Zephyrs legend, could score the ball, could rebound the ball. Like I said, 19 rebounds a game to start his career. Finished his career 20-13. 130 win shares. I mean, this is just a guy that's got to be on this list. And one of his nicknames is Mr. Bellamy. And I want that he clearly was intimidating because no one gave him an actual nickname. Everyone called him Mr. Bellamy as if he's your girlfriend's dad.
Bentley, you had him on your list.
I did have him on my list. He's on my, so I'll caveat this. He's on my list of honorable mentions. Just a reminder to the listening audience, this is an NBA top 100 list, not a basketball top 100 list. So because of his...
For the listeners out there, it's the Baltimore Bullets.
Yeah.
Not the Washington Bullets.
Yeah. No, I mean the dude, yeah, he started his career in the ABA, right? But he was also dominant once he did come over to the NBA. The reason I didn't have him like firmly on my top 100 list is just because of the lack of time spent in the NBA dominating, as opposed to the ABA as well. But that's to say nothing about his basketball prowess. The dude was an unstoppable force on the court, and there was really nothing that could be done about it. Also, the street that I grew up on was Bellamy Lane, so how could I not, right?
Nice. Yeah, I had him in that grouping, with like Bernard King and Sweet Lou, like those guys. Like I've got like about 5 I think I had that were, guys that I wanted to give some love to, give some recognition to, but I wasn't sure which ones I was going to pick. And there were a couple that I was like, I know Ryan's going to look because Ryan is who he is, and others that I wasn't necessarily convinced on. He's kind of in that group of those for me. So for me, I can't complain that he would make a top 100 list. I don't know that I would have in the end put him on there, and it's only because of the way his career kind of progressed. He a lot of his biggest numbers were when he was in the ABA, and then for reasons that are kind of out of his control, kind of out of maybe anybody's control. The second half of his career, not as productive as the first half. Obviously, he played in the era, Ryan mentioned Wilt, and then, of course, comes over to the NBA and his numbers aren't quite the same. So I sort of knocked him down my list for that reason, but it's sort of unfair to him, honestly, because the beginning of his career was just ridiculous for sure, as Ryan already highlighted. All right, Bentley, who's next on your list?
So I have one that I'm looking at, but I'm gonna skip him. I kind of put mine in order of who I think deserves it more, but I'm gonna skip over the one, and I'm gonna drop down to another common theme here on my list. There are players from Toronto, and I'm gonna mention the one and only Vince Carter. Played in 4 decades. Pretty impressive, if you ask me. Played 24 years in the NBA. Made 8 All-Star teams, made 2 All-NBA teams, and was Rookie of the Year in 98-99. Averaged 17, 4, and 3 on 44, 37, 80. To average 37% three-point field goal percentage. 37% from behind the arc for 24 years. That's pretty good, especially coming into a league that didn't value the three-pointer the way that we do now, right? So he's a volume guy for a lot of his career. So the 44% from the field, I don't really knock him for that. Aside from his scoring, just the pure athleticism. We all remember him jamming his elbow in the rim. The dude could dunk from almost anywhere on the court. He's widely regarded as potentially the best dunker of all time. A lot of people will say that. It's like him and Dominique Wilkins, maybe. And to me, I value how much he was able to change his play style as his career progressed, right? The guy that was in Atlanta, the guy that was in Dallas is different than the guy that was in Toronto, And to me, that shows basketball IQ, willingness to play in a team setting, valuing again the success of a team rather than the success of the individual. Vince Carter was a class act, and he did it at a high level for a long time. And those are all things that I value. And I think that you probably cannot tell the story of basketball without Vince Carter. And he'll be a Hall of Famer here shortly, whenever his ballot comes up. I think he's one of the 100 best. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I had him on my list, and I sort of was reserving him, figuring that somebody might pick him. So I wanted to get a couple other guys in here with my earlier picks. But you mentioned his numbers, right? His averages would be very different if he hadn't been the guy that you said he was, right? He was a leader, a team guy, a mentor. He took on that role for the last 8-10 years of his career, and it shows in his kind of productivity numbers, right? He had a precipitous drop off as he started to migrate to other teams. You look, he's under 10 points, but he's still getting minutes. He's still getting run. He's still a guy that's contributing in terms of leadership and being a locker room guy. I know that he really took Trae Young, especially under his wings when Trae was first drafted there in Atlanta. And you look at prior to that point, he's probably closer to like 21, I think was his average before that. So you're talking about a 4-point swing over the end of his career, right? So, but yeah, it's the highlights, right? It's the highlights, and you put it very succinctly. When I have a conversation with people who want to kind of nitpick at maybe Hall of Famers, that sort of thing, like, can you write the history of whatever sport, right, or whatever game without this person? If your answer is no, then they're one of the greatest. They're one of the best. They're Hall of Famer, whatever distinction you're trying to put on them. And I don't think you can, in terms of his ability on the court, what he was able to do. And then it's the highlights, right? You mentioned the dunk contest stuff of putting your elbow through the rim. Everybody tries to replicate that. A dunk contest doesn't go by that somebody doesn't do a variation of that. Is it two arms in the rim? Is it trying to get your whole arm in the rim? That sort of thing. But then there was the dunk over the big Frenchman too, right? That gets played all the time. Just for his highlights, you know, he's an all-timer. But then you dig into the player that he was, and absolutely, I had him on my list as well. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, I think he's on the fringe of this list. I could see him being in or out, and I can see an argument for both, right? He's in that granular stage. He's tough because his peak is pretty not short, but he becomes like just a good player for a long time, right? Like he's a great player for like a 3 or 4 year period. And what I will say is his per possession stays pretty consistent all the way through like his New Jersey years. So you could make the argument that his efficiency gets better as he gets older, but he scores less because the team is better, right? Like that's kind of what's happening, I think. So I think, you know, from a pure numbers perspective, really till he's 30, he's a great player. And the longevity, you have to give him a ton of credit for. I mean, playing until you're 43 is extremely impressive. And shooting, like you said, he was shooting 5 threes a game in the early 2000s. I mean, that was just not something I ever remember seeing. There weren't a lot of guys doing that. You know, for a guy as athletic as he was to develop those skills is impressive. I think he's in the conversation. I think those Nets teams were really good. They're kind of a forgotten team because they didn't win a championship. Those teams with Jefferson and Kidd and him, really interesting teams that got blown up for a variety of reasons. But I think the narrative is important. His standing in the history of the game is important, and I think that was a smart move to talk about that.
Excellent. All right, so I'm gonna go off my radar a little bit. As I was doing research for this, I didn't realize just how important this guy, and it's an expansion team. It's not a team that's been around forever, but just how important he is in the history of this team, but also when he transitioned to the Bad Boy Pistons and was a contributor there on 2 title teams. Mark Aguirre is probably right now the second best Dallas Maverick to ever play behind Dirk Nowitzki. Guy who averaged 25 and 3, Had a really high efficiency rating. Not a ton of win shares because he was on those Dallas teams that just didn't win a lot before he went over to Detroit. On those Bad Boys Pistons teams, he was still a contributor, 15 points a game, 4.5 to 5 rebounds. And like I said, he won 2 titles there. 3-time All-Star. For me, I think when you are on that short list of best players for a franchise, it's hard to not consider it, even though it is kind of the Dallas Mavericks. But for me, as I was looking, I started to do some research on like who are players that are widely considered like underrated players, and he was super high on that list. So that made me dig into Mark Aguirre and who he was, and the combination of who he was in Dallas, being one of their all-timers, and then going to Detroit and winning a couple titles with the Bad Boy Pistons, who for the longest time couldn't get over the hump, right, and win those titles. So for me, those two reasons combined are why I've got Mark Aguirre on my top 100. Ryan, what are your thoughts here on Mark Aguirre?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty bold take to take a guy who's not in the Hall of Fame, and I'm not against it. I think that he should be in the Hall of Fame.
That's another tragic piece. I didn't mention it either. When I looked at his Basketball Reference page, I could not believe that he was in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, it is shocking, right? Like his Dallas numbers could be argued that they're a little hollow because that team was terrible. That's the expansion Dallas team, right? Until they get Rolando Blackman and those type of guys, they really were really bad. And but he did put, 30 points a game one season, 25 till he's 27 years old. His really early years, dominant scorer. I do think he's really underrated. Yeah, I think he clearly showed he's a team player when he was traded to Detroit, right? Who was he traded for? Adrian Dantley, who was brought up earlier. Adrian Dantley was traded because they didn't think they could do enough with him because they thought he wanted to be the guy. And they were like, this team doesn't have a guy. And if it is, it's Isaiah Thomas. And so they got rid of Dantley to bring in Mark Aguirre, who had some injuries before this, but was the guy in Dallas and was able to transition to a second, third option on multiple championship teams. So I think from a legacy perspective, we have to consider that. I think the argument that his stats are a little hollow early in his career are fair. Those teams were pretty bad. But he's in the conversation. He should be in the Hall of Fame. There's guys that are worse than it. Like if Andre Iguodala goes into the Hall of Fame, then Mark Aguirre should have been in 10 years ago. Yeah, he wasn't a first balloter, but he's in that next group. So
and by the way, BK would disagree. It was not Isaiah Thomas. It was Bill Laimbeer.
Well, or
BK
or Rick Mahorn.
Yeah.
Those two guys. But yeah, I don't hate it. He'd be like in my 150 probably, like in that next group. He was not on my list, but it's not the worst thing I've ever heard.
Bentley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've got him at 102. Right behind my earlier 101 selection. No, he was absolutely phenomenal in Dallas. He was 25, 6 and 4, something like that. But like Ryan said, maybe good stats, bad team guy. Like the team was bad, not he was a bad team guy. He wasn't on my list. Full disclosure, he was a really good player. Maybe only 3 All-Star teams hurt him in the Hall of Fame voting there. Yeah, he's probably on the 150 list here. I don't know if he cracks my top 100, but I mean, if you're still one of the 150 best players ever in the NBA, that's really fucking good.
For sure. All right, Ryan, your next pick.
All right, I'm going to take a Philadelphia legend. Going way back here, started playing in 1951. So pretty old. Donald Neil Johnston is who I will be taking. Has one of the best nicknames, Ol' Hoss. That's when you know the dads like you when they're calling you. That guy's Ol' Hoss. I mean, that just shows the dominance he had. He is a guy who existed in an NBA in its infantile stages, right? 1949 is the beginning of the NBA. He starts playing in 1951. His career ends in 1959 due to a terrible knee injury that completely ended his career. He could not come back like Bernard King 30 years later. They were still figuring out like penicillin, I believe, at that point.
They were still leeching during
yeah.
surgery.
Yeah. He is in a bridge, right? He's the bridge between Mikan, who dominated the early league, to Bill Russell to Wilt Chamberlain. He's right in between. He wins a championship with the Philadelphia Warriors, to be exact, not the 76ers. This team eventually becomes the Golden State Warriors. He led the league in scoring for 3 straight years. How many guys on this list led the league in scoring for more than one season? Like McGrady, I think that's like the only other guy that we like have. Alex English, I believe, did it twice. His dominance for this 7-year period offensively was incredible. He was an 11 rebound guy for his career. His criticism is that he didn't have much of a defensive game and that their defenses were terrible. And, centers in the 50s that couldn't play defense didn't get to stay around very long. So it just shows how good offensively he was to hang around for as long as he did. And if it wasn't for his knee injury, he'd be in these conversations. He's a 6-time All-Star, 3-time scoring champ, 1-time NBA champ, 5-time All-NBA. I mean, that resume alone is up there with a lot of guys, right? He'd probably be an MVP if the MVP existed at that time. It did not exist, but he would likely have been a top 3 guy in the MVP voting at that point, multiple years in a row. So I think just that resume alone, he has to be in the conversation based off how we're looking at this. And I wish he could have played longer and made it 2 more years to play with Wilt Chamberlain. That would have been a wild team because that's who eventually gets him. So kind of an interesting history there, and it's sad that his career ended as early as it did.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's hard in terms of, Ryan, you are right, the resident historian, and we've said that several times throughout this episode. And I knew, and we knew coming into this, that you were going to have some of these guys that played in these eras when it's hard to judge that, right? And without doing that deep dive research like you do, some of these numbers can feel really superficial, right? Because it's the 51-52 NBA season when they had 12 teams in the league, and half of them were plumbers during the day and played basketball at night, right? So it's hard sometimes for like guys like myself, who I consider myself a passionate fan, but like I'm not diving into the 1951-52 NBA season to understand just what Neil Johnston meant to a Philadelphia Warriors team, right, that won a title and during his 7 years of dominance, right? So I say all that to say, right, like it's really interesting, right? And it's really fun to hear all this, and I don't have a retort, but I'm just warning people out there, don't get lost in the sauce when you're looking at it and saying, yeah, but he played in 1950, right? Those sorts of things. I guess I kind of laid the groundwork to tell people not to be the get off my lawn guy. Bentley, you got any thoughts here on a game you probably missed because Union Station was busy said day, right?
Yeah, I'm not even sure Union Station was built yet. And my horse was in the shop that day, so I just couldn't. I tried to call my buddy Paul Revere to see if I could hitch a ride, and he just wasn't answering his cell phone for some reason.
That's because the British were coming.
Well, yeah, I think he was probably busy, Providence or something. I don't know. I think it's a terrible take. I think that Ryan should be banned from selecting players that literally there is not footage of.
Yeah, just like Wilt's 100-point game, it doesn't count.
Yeah, he played it in a barn. It doesn't count. This isn't hockey. No, I have no issue with you taking that guy because I've literally never heard of it before. So I'm just gonna be straight up, all right.
Bentley, who's your next pick?
All right, I'm gonna take a guy that I know that we have all heard of before. I'm going to take a player who has a lot of counting stats. This is So when I went into this list, obviously stats are kind of the only thing we have to base careers off of, right? Specifically guys that we haven't watched play, like a lot of Ryan's picks, and not a knock, like those were great players, they deserve to be mentioned. But it's hard for me to conceptualize the impact that those players had because I don't see all I can see are the numbers that they put up. I can't see the way they affected games, the people they played against, the people they played with, stuff like that, right? So like if you're wondering why his list is so skewed in the past and why mine is so present, that's kind of how I do it. I view basketball as like the things that I can see and my understanding of the way that a certain player affects the game, right? And so mine is a little less based off of the numbers and kind of the way that I see it. So for that reason, I'm picking Luka Doncic. Luka Doncic, Luka Doncic is one of the 100 best basketball players of all time, and you can say anything you want, you're not going to change my mind of that. I remember, so I tell the story often about watching Zion's first game at Duke and calling my dad and saying, "Hey, this guy's special," yada yada yada. I remember I didn't call my dad after watching Luka play, but we were having lunch or something one day, and I said, "Dad, like, you're going to see over the next decade, there are going to be a lot of headlines that say only 2 players have ever done this at this age, right? And it's going to be LeBron James and Luka Doncic." And I've been right.
Yeah.
From the day that Luka stepped foot on a basketball court in Dallas, Texas, he's been the best player on that team. He's been one of the 10 best players in the NBA, and he doesn't have an MVP. He's never been to the conference finals. I don't care about any of that. Luka Doncic is one of the 5 best basketball players in the entire world. And I think that projecting forward for the rest of his career, he could be one of the 15, 20 best players to play basketball ever. The things that this guy is able to do on a basketball court at his size and his specific athleticism profile, because he's another guy that, you put 2 pieces of paper on the floor and he can't jump over them. But it doesn't matter because he plays at a pace and uses his size and physicality level to get to a spot. Any spot on the court that he wants. If he wants to take a step back from 35 feet, he will. If he wants to get into the paint and shoot a floater, he's going to do that. His career averages are 28, 9, and 8 on 47, 34, 74. He's been in the league for 5 years and made 4 All-NBA teams. Like, the guy is one of the 100 best basketball players of all time, and I firmly believe that.
Ryan, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know we all appreciate what and who Luka is in terms of his game, what he does on the floor, what he does for Dallas on a roster that for 4 out of the 5 years of his career has been really devoid of talent in terms of supporting talent. They tried this year to go get Kyrie. It didn't necessarily work out the way they wanted it to, but we'll see, right? Year 6, we'll see. What are your thoughts here on Bentley putting in a guy who's got 5 years in the league? We talked about it with Jokic, right? He super decorated, won a title, finals MVP. He's got 2 MVPs. Luka's sort of in the same, with the exception Jokic has got a couple more seasons on him. But what are your thoughts here on a guy 5 years into his career? Are we ready to anoint him one of the top 100?
Yeah, I think he should be in there. I think if you're putting David Thompson in there, Luka Doncic should be in there. So I can't make any argument against it. I think that if he retired today, he'd likely be in the conversation if they made a 100 list today. Now, it'd be difficult if they made it 25 years later because he didn't have the longevity. But today, yes, I would put him in the top 100. I think, like you said, he breaks every statistic, or at least is in the conversation with LeBron in the way he affects the game. One of the best players I've ever seen live, which I agree with Bentley. There is something about that you can't replicate on a website or on a sheet of paper, right? With their statistics, he makes his teammates better. He rebounds well. I mean, the guy can do everything. There's not really much to be mad about. If he plays 2 more years, we might be talking top 50. If he plays 2 more years after that, he might be moving up 5-10 spots every other year, and that wouldn't shock me just because of the accumulation of statistics. He just needs to win. and he can get into that, I think he legitimately could end up in the top 20 conversation. Just needs to win, because you have to once you're at that level.
Yeah, for sure. I can't disagree with anything you guys said. I think what he's done so far speaks for itself, but also projecting ahead, he's just going to continue to get better. This year, it seemed like he finally realized, hey, I've got to take care of my body too and get in better basketball shape. That's always been kind of the knock on him the first 3 to 4 years in the league, that he would wear down late in games, wear down late in the season. Little soft, I guess, is probably the way to describe him in terms of kind of the physique, right? But I think if he continues to fine tune his physicality, he's just going to continue to get better. He's already got everything, with the exception of a willingness to play defense. He's already got everything now. He puts up gaudy numbers, gets all of his teammates involved. He's an unselfish guy who scores 30 points a game, right? Hard to knock that for sure. All right. My next pick is Ryan. I'm going to go to your well in Denver. Not necessarily mostly known for his time in Denver, unless you were a guy watching basketball in the 80s, 90s. More maybe known for some of his time with AI in Philly. I'm going with the Sultan of SWAT, the defensive king, Mount Mutombo, Dikembe Mutombo. He's about as decorated a guy as you're going to find who his main focus was, or I guess the main thing he was famous for was defense. He's a Hall of Famer, 8-time All-Star. Twice he led the league in rebounds. 3 times he led the league in blocks. 3 All-NBA teams, 6 All-Defensive teams, and 4 times Defensive Player of the Year. And famously in an All-Star game, he was 6 years into his career and was able to tell Michael Jordan that he hadn't dunked on him yet, except Jordan got him later in that season. So feared guy defensively, 4 blocks a game. Twice in his 3 times really in his career, if you round up from 3.9. Career, he averaged 3.2, I think it was, blocks per game, or 2.9, something like that, just above or just below 3. Not a big time number in terms of scoring, but if you look kind of at how his career progressed, the end of his career really hurt him in terms of his numbers for points per game. So you're going to see a number below 10, but several times in his career, he was at a dozen or so points a game. Not necessarily a guy who was ever the focal point of, the offense. You look at his time with Atlanta, his time with Philly especially. He played with guys that were more the focal point of the offense. But you look at what he contributed in terms of rebounding as well. Just a monster on the boards, over 10 for his career, 117 win shares, and a pretty good efficiency rating for a guy who, like I said, his offensive numbers were never really his focal point. Efficient, effective, scored around the rim, shot a pretty decent percentage free throw wise. I always like to point that out when big guys, especially big guys that are as long and gangly as a guy like Dikembe Mutombo was, shot nearly 70% for his career from the free throw line. Bentley, what are your thoughts on Mount Mutombo?
I love the pick. I have him on my list of honorable mentions here. I think it's tough to put a list of 100 best basketball players of all time without putting probably the best rim protector we've ever seen on there. The dude was okay. Well, you got to understand, Ryan, basketball only started in 1980, so like
you still get Olajuwon.
I know you do. I know. Okay, so it's hard to put together a list of the top 100 basketball players of all time without putting on there one of the best rim protectors we've ever seen.
He's all-time commercial guy too. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
No, not in my house is maybe it's one of the best ever. It is in the Hall of Fame of commercial series.
And his nickname is the Sultan of SWAT. Like, that's like the Minister of Defense for Reggie White. Like, just all-time name. Yeah. So I love it.
For sure. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Mutombo?
Yeah, I'm glad to get another Houston Rockets legend in here, as I've stated many times. His years backing up Yao Ming were some of the great years in Rockets history. I mean, that front line could intimidate anybody. Yao Ming comes off the floor, and the the second all-time shot blocks leader comes off, even at 38 to 42, I believe is when he played for the Rockets. He was pretty old.
Yep.
I agree. Could score early in his career. Figured out real quickly that he didn't need to really affect the game. He rebounded well. He protected the rim, as good as anybody. I think he's got to be in that conversation. I think, again, because his points are not as high, a lot of people will critique him for that. But if you asked a coach, would you want a center who scores 30 a game and gets 5 rebounds and doesn't protect the rim, or a guy who scores 10 and shuts down the rim? I imagine they would, and in rebounds, I imagine they'd take the guy who shuts down the rim and rebounds, because that's what a traditional center does. I also want to highlight, he started his career at 25 years old.
Yeah.
Who knows what he would have looked like with 3-4 more years on top of that, as far as counting stats goes.
Yeah.
It is crazy that he played as long as he did and started at 25. It's an impressive stat. I love the guy. I think he's a great humanitarian. I think that needs to be brought up as well, just from the history of the game and his impact in his home continent, in Africa, building hospitals and things like that. Just an all-time great guy. And an all-time great player. I love the pick. I think he needs to be on the list for sure.
All right, excellent. All right, so we are progressing into our final round here. We've made 21 picks so far. We have 3 picks left to make. So Ryan, kick us off here in our final round of picks.
Yeah, this is really hard.
Honorable mentions at the end.
Yeah, this is tough. This is tough, right? Because I have my list that is now only 25 people, and I have to decide which one I want to highlight as the guy, right?
Who are you going to leave off? Who's going to be your snub?
I broke it while y'all have been talking. I've broke it down to 5 people and I'll mention all of them if they don't get mentioned. The honorable mention, the guy I'm going to take, and because I want to talk about him more than the others, that's really it's vanity. The reason I'm taking him, but I'm going to take Spencer Haywood. Spencer Haywood was a dominant force at 19 years old in the ABA his first year, immediately jumps to the NBA right after, and is a dominant force for Seattle. He also was a great player for the Knicks. He has the problem that David Thompson has. He had a cocaine problem that really hurt his career. He also allegedly tried to hire an assassin to kill his coach while a member of the Lakers. I'll ignore all that in my analysis of him because I'm talking about him as a player. He averaged over 22 points a game pretty much every season, except for his first season in the NBA because there were legal issues. He was a double-digit rebounder, could protect the rim a little bit, but really an offensive center that could do a little bit of everything offensively. Just a dominant force at a super young age. If the cocaine didn't catch up to him, I think his numbers are crazy. He gets into the Hall of Fame pretty late because of his personal issues that we talked about a little bit. The one thing I want to highlight is he sued the NBA to play into the NBA, right? He wanted to play. He wanted to leave the ABA and play in the NBA. The NBA would not let him. He started one of the major cases in drafting players and how they're able to play. His Supreme Court case, because it went all the way to the Supreme Court, is extremely vital to how free agency works, to how drafting works. It still took many more years to get it all figured out, but at that time, you couldn't jump. And his story and the effort he put in to let guys in, guys like Moses Malone wouldn't have been able to come into the league. He would pretty much have to go to college, right? Things like hardship cases and stuff like that. So I think his story and his dominance need to be told, and I just wanted to highlight that I think that's a really interesting part of history, basketball history, and he was a good player. As he said in his Hall of Fame speech, he gave that whole speech, talked about the case. He said, I also want people to remember I was pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I like the pick. Just an absolute wrecking ball early in his career. I mean, his first season, 30 and 20. I just want to point out one other thing about his first season. This has 2 points of connection for Ryan. One, he's picked a bunch of Denver players tonight, but also he's a Rockets fan, and he started his career with the Denver Rockets.
Named after a trucking company.
Yeah.
the guy owned a Rockets Trucking. It had nothing to do with actual Rockets.
Yeah. A little different than the Houston team, right?
Yeah.
All right, Bentley, what are your thoughts here on Spencer Haywood? Sorry.
It's a good pick. Ryan and I have talked a lot about Spencer over the years. You know, he's one of the most interesting NBA players, like on and off the court, really.
Yeah.
Is he one of the best 100? Potentially, probably. But the case is there to be made. I have no qualms with that pick.
Nice. So Bentley, give us your last pick.
I have a whole list here of kind of honorable mentions since all of my short list guys were taken. And one of these guys, well, a lot of them are in the Hall of Fame. But I'm going to go with one that is not in the Hall of Fame. He's probably a fringe Hall of Famer, which probably means he should not be on the top 100 list, but it's a guy that I
picked the non-Hall of Famer.
That is true. That is true. This is a player that I really loved watching. He was on one of the most formative teams in the NBA, kind of changed the game before, maybe not before. It kind of ushered in the era of basketball that we're almost living in right now, right? His name is Amar'e Stoudemire. Amar'e Stoudemire played on those Steve Nash Suns teams.
Yeah.
Career 19-8 on 54% field goal shooting. That's pretty good. Like to be able to do that for 15 years, I'd say you're easily one of the best players, to ever play the game. Right, where he falls on your list, is up for you to decide. I think that he was dominant in his own way. That he didn't try to do more than what was asked of him within the team frame. Right, like was he the second best player on that team? Yes, for sure. But he allowed Steve Nash to run that team the way that Steve Nash thought was best. Right, he didn't go to Steve and be like, oh hey, like I need the ball here, I need to do all these things. Like he played that 7 seconds or less for not being a shooter. He played that game as well as I think could have been orchestrated. And then he went to New York and played with Melo and it was really good in his own right in New York as well. Like he was better in Phoenix, but he was also really, really good in New York. And he took wine baths. So I just think that's really cool as well. I was a big fan of Amar'e Stoudemire. I think I would put him on my list if given the opportunity. So that's why I'm taking him.
Yeah, I love this pick. I don't know that I didn't have him on my list to consider in the top 100, probably maybe unfairly, but I was a Suns fan during that era, right? I've told you guys I've never really had a team necessarily that I just settled on, and I usually find a player or a team that I really like their style. I loved that 7 seconds or less style. I loved the D'Antoni Suns. I thought they got jobbed against the Spurs, and they should have won a title that year, but I'll digress off of that. To talk about Amar'e Stoudemire, he was one of the more fun players in the NBA to watch during that time because he was very different from the rest of the team in terms of how he contributed to that 7 seconds or less. It was high screens, and I'm going to the rack, and I'm coming with vengeance, and if you throw it anywhere near the rim, I'm stuffing it on somebody's head. Maybe that contributed to the fact that he ended up with microfracture surgery, and you mentioned that he was a very different player with the Knicks, and I think it had a lot, obviously the microfractures reacted differently for different players throughout time, but typically it saps a lot of that athleticism. But he was so fun to watch, and if you were a fantasy player during the time that he played, he was a fucking stud because he would fill it up, shoot good percentage because he was always attacking at the rim. Really good rebounder, not a bad defender. Got a lot more blocks than probably his defensive prowess, if you will, would tell you that he would have gotten. But man, was he fucking fun to watch within that offense and the way that Nash was able to orchestrate that and how he just fit. It was different. A lot of shooters, a lot of guys that shot a lot of mid-range shots. Shawn Marion with the all-time weirdest shot, maybe him and Kevin Martin probably, but Yeah, that was my favorite team during that time frame. I loved Steve Nash was my favorite player, but Amari Stoudemire was so fun to watch. Ryan, what do you think about Amari?
Yeah, I think the sad part about Amari is I think once he figured the game out, his knees gave out, similar to McGrady in a lot of ways. They have McGrady obviously was not nearly as bad. Stoudemire's career is basically over after the knee injuries. His first year at the Knicks, he averages 25 a game, played 78 games that season, and he basically is done. Soon after, he's 28 years old. If he's healthy, I think he's in the 75 discussion. I don't think he's in the 100 discussion. Yeah. I love that Phoenix team. There's actually a teammate I would have taken over him if I was going to make the list. But
I know what you're talking about.
I don't. I actually thought that's
Barbosa, right?
Yeah, Raja Bell.
Raja Bell, yeah. Yeah. Actually, Kirk Thomas is who.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think in his peak, I mean, there wasn't much of an offensive force better. I do think those block numbers are inflated because of his athleticism, which is not abnormal. But I don't think he was a terrible defender for like the 4 position. He had the perfect size, and there weren't a lot of like shooters he had to chase around back then. Yeah, I would have loved to see him stay longer. I would have loved to see them win a championship. I love that Mike D'Antoni team. That was, again, in my formative years as well. Houston played them multiple times. I loved watching Yao Ming try to chase that team around. I think Stoudemire's in the discussion. And like I said, I wish he was an easy vote for the 75, because that would have mean we got like 3 or 4 more years with him. And I think that Knicks team could have been super competitive.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I'm going to close with a pick that I think is pretty close and near and dear to Bentley's heart. A guy that we talk about injuries, right, and is kind of lumped into that conversation of he was supposed to be like the next Michael Jordan. He was supposed to be the next great thing, maybe LeBron before LeBron, a guy that could do everything, filled every part of the stat sheet, a defensive stalwart, good facilitator for the small forward position. Played a bit of shooting guard too throughout his career, in all fairness in terms of facilitating. But Grant Hill, incredible player in Detroit, considered, maybe the best player in the league at the time. It was at the end of the Jordan era, and everybody was trying to figure out who was going to be that next guy. High point in his career, 26 points a game, but averaged 6 and 4 in terms of boards and boards and assists. And if it wasn't for the last probably 4 years of his career where he stuck around in Phoenix and ended up in LA with the Clippers for a year, those numbers would be higher, right? He's closer to a 18, 6.5 and 5 guy, as opposed to a 17, 6 and 4 guy. If he doesn't stick around and hang with Phoenix and the Clippers at the end of his career. Hall of Famer, 7-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA, obviously early in his career. Missed an entire season in 03-04 with that ankle injury. It was one that plagued him his entire time in Orlando. Orlando should have hit a home run, right, with that trade, but obviously health and those considerations. But for me, he also won Rookie of the Year. About 100 win shares, huge efficiency rating, a guy that could do everything for a team, and in my opinion, still one of the 100 best players to ever play the game. Bentley, I'm saving you for last, bud, for obvious reasons. But Ryan, what are your thoughts on Grant Hill?
Peak, amazing peak. Really sad to see the injuries take him out. I think he's a forgotten star. He was the next Jordan to a lot of people. One of the great Duke players of all time. What a great Duke team, by the way, a great college player. Multiple great Duke teams, but we all know which one I'm talking about. Christian Laettner, the star of those teams, clearly. I mean, I wish we had more time, right? Like, I just wish we had more time with him. I wish we had more to see from him. He could do everything. He was really a modern forward, the scoring forward that we see in the league now. And I wish we had more time. I'll never be mad about people wanting to include him in this conversation.
Yeah. All right, Bentley. The floor is yours, bud.
Grant Hill is a true tragedy case in terms of NBA health. The guy, like Ryan said, he was on pace to be the next Jordan, but bigger. It's hard to say more athletic, right? Because who's more athletic than Michael Jordan? It's a handful of guys, and I don't think Grant Hill's in that group.
If you played NBA Jam, though, he was pretty unbelievable.
True. The dude had skills that just had not been discovered by other NBA players, like still haven't been discovered by certain NBA players in the league today. Like there was nothing on the basketball court that Grant Hill could not do other than stay healthy. But you can't really knock him for that, right? Like that, it's the Tracy McGrady thing, and the Amari Stoudemire thing. It's so many guys that like, but his trajectory was like if you put him in a list of people that are affected by injury, his trajectory was so much higher than what most people's are going to be, right? Like he was going to be multiple-time MVP, probably multiple-time champion. Like, say all of that to say that he went to Duke. So I mean, obviously he has to be on this list, right? Like we get just honorary. He went to Duke, so you got to throw him in the top 100 all time, right? It just makes sense. He learned from the best. Like when you learn from the best, you just are one of the best. It's kind of how that goes, right? No, I love Grant Hill. I really do. He looked super cool in those teal Pistons jerseys with a horse on the front. Bring those back, please, NBA.
Right. They have. I think they wear them sometimes.
On occasion, yeah. I saw them wear them last year, like once or twice.
I saw Jaden Ivey in one.
Yeah.
It's like their R Town uniform or something, right?
Yeah. I love that jersey too. I love that jersey.
Yeah, for sure. One of the all-time great uniforms for sure. The Rainbow Nuggets uniform and the teal Pistons ones are some of the old school ones that are really good.
The black pinstripe Magic uniform.
Oh yes, the ones that Shaq was tearing backboards off.
Yes, please.
For sure. All right, I'm going to open the floor for a few minutes for each of you to give some honorable mentions here. Ryan, what are a few names you want to crowbar in here as guys you considered but didn't quite make the list?
So what I will say is I broke my list down into older players. I told both of y'all that I would just to kind of give some representation to guys who are forgotten by even some of our parents.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get. There are guys, more modern guys, I would have taken. I'm not going to list those just because I think Bentley and you could probably list some of those guys. Some of the older guys I considered. George McGinnis, I think, is right on the fringe. Connie Hawkins, because he was barred from playing for so long. If he was able to play, he would for sure be in the top 75, if not higher. But because of the point shaving scandal, he wasn't able to play. Jack Twyman, who has one of the great stories. The Teammate Award is named after Jack Twyman because he took care of Maurice Stokes after he paralyzed himself. A very sad story, but Jack Twyman was a great Hall of Fame player. Ed McCauley, one of the great Celtics. Ed McCauley is the only Celtics player that has his jersey retired without winning a championship with the Celtics, which is a rarity. Joe Dumars somehow didn't get brought up.
True.
Dennis Johnson, Sidney Moncrief, Paul Westphal, JoJo White, Sean Kemp. Some guys I was thinking about. And I think there's a lot more modern guys. There's about 30 other dudes we could probably have said, and I would have said, yeah.
Yeah, Sean Kemp's peak was pretty awesome too.
Yep. If he wasn't so fat.
His the fact that his dunk and then point still lives on in TikTok fame is pretty tremendous. He was that
might be the most disrespectful dunk of all time. I think in Shea Serrano's book he has a chapter called "What is the most disrespectful dunk?" and I believe he rates that as number one.
It makes sense. You point at him. You're pointing at him while you're backpedaling down the court. That's pretty.
That'd be like 7 technicals nowadays.
Oh yeah, you're thrown out of the damn game. You're thrown out of the season. You do something like that.
Yep.
While the guy's laying on the floor too, right? It wasn't just pointing at a dude who's standing under the bucket to inbound the ball. He's laying on the floor.
Yep.
You're better off flashing a gun and Instagram Live.
Yeah. Bentley, who you got on your honorable mention list here?
All right, so I I knew that Ryan was going to go older, so I went with some more recent guys. Some are still active, actually. Some that are not, but guys that if they were to come out next year and do a top 100 list, I think probably would be on here. And then there's one who is kind of like a selfish pick because he's one of my favorite players of all time, and I think that he is deserving of a lot more attention and credit than he's given. Kind of the way that his career ended was not favorable. So I'll just start at the top. We'll go Klay Thompson. He'll be on a list one day somewhere. Draymond Green will be on a list one day somewhere. Ryan's favorite Suns player, Sean Marion, I believe deserves to be on a list. He probably deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, actually.
Yeah.
Ryan and I were doing was it because of the grid? Maybe one day we were doing a deep dive on him.
Yep.
Very impressive career, a very great player.
Quiet.
Did it for a long time.
Tremendous career.
Yeah. Manu, I debated taking him with my last pick. Didn't want to do too many Spurs, but Manu's an all-time guy. In the Hall of Fame. Ben Wallace, all-time undrafted guy, defensive stud, Bulls legend, obviously. Kyrie Irving, as much as I'm not a fan of his on or off the court, really, I don't like his game that much. I respect how talented and great he is, but I wouldn't want him to be a basketball player on my team. Future Hall of Famer, though, for sure. Alonzo Mourning, Hall of Famer. He was actually the one I was going back and forth about with Amari Stoudemire, like which one to pick, Alonzo or Amari. I think a lot of people recognize Alonzo as probably being better than Amari Stoudemire, so that's why I went with Amari. I thought it was more interesting, and I preferred Amari. And then the last one, this one is my selfish pick because I love this player. Rajon Rondo. I love Rajon Rondo, even though he went to Kentucky. I just remember him in the 2008 run with the Celtics to the title, watching multiple games in that playoff stretch where he was the best player on the floor. All the 20 plus assist games that he had. And he was a defensive stopper early in his career, and it was a better scorer than he gets credit for. He averages like 9.8 points a game for his career, but a lot of that is at the end where he just wasn't playing. It wasn't doing much. I love Rondo. I think he's one of the best point guards ever, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, Rondo's point, sort of the problem with him in scoring too is like he just never shot.
Yeah,
he just didn't take shots. So
yep.
And he's a dickhead, right? So people don't like him.
Sure.
But he's probably one of the brightest basketball minds that maybe has ever been on a basketball floor.
Yeah.
To hear him and some of the conversations that, guys will talk about things that he's done, right, in terms of practice and talking about the game and that sort of stuff. It's amazing. He's sort of like a beautiful mind when it comes to basketball. So, good shout out there. I've got a couple others. You hit a bunch that I was gonna hit there. Bentley for the modern guys. Paul George is another one. I think one of the great two-way guys, like a Klay Thompson, probably doesn't get the respect he deserves on a grander stage because he hasn't necessarily made a long run into the playoffs at least currently in his career. Joel Embiid, another guy who I think is eventually gonna be on that list. Chauncey Billups, a guy I think gets overlooked a lot in terms of what he contributed to the Ben Wallace Pistons, right? And one of the great intros ever, the announcer there at the Palace, Chauncey Billups. That was always fun to hear. Mo Cheeks, jersey's retired, hanging in the rafters in Philadelphia, won a title, made 4 all defensive teams. Fat Lever, all nickname team. 15, 6, and 6 for his career, averaged over 8 rebounds 4 times in his career from the point guard position. Not a guy I was going to put in the list, but I kind of wanted to mention him just as kind of the name. Ryan, I think you mentioned Dennis Johnson, another guy I wanted to. He was kind of the glue guy there in Boston, Hall of Famer, won 3 titles, All-Star 5 times, all defensive team 9 times in his career. And And one I want to save to the end, who I only wanted to point out one thing about this guy, Marcus Johnson, who invented the phrase the point forward. Out of necessity,
Yep.
he played point guard for the Milwaukee Bucks in the playoffs because they'd had 20 injuries during that season. And he was asked after one of the games, like, what sort of role do you play or whatever? And he said, I am actually the point forward for this team, which is a term we use a lot in today's game, right?
Yeah.
For a lot of these guys that are big point guards that probably could play the forward position in a traditional NBA lineup, but play point guard. LeBron James might be the most famous example of somebody who plays that point forward position, but all started with Marcus Johnson. All right, I want to run down the list here of the 24 guys so that we've got a tally of who we picked, and we can take a look forward and see if once 25 years from now, well, 23 now, I think 24 years from now, whether they make the list. So in no particular order, it just happened to be how I had my list, plus the guys that Ryan brought up that weren't on my list will be at the end. No offense, Ryan, just how an Excel spreadsheet works. Adrian Dantley, Pau Gasol, Tracy McGrady, Alex English, Bernard King, Vince Carter, Tony Parker, Chris Bosh, Dwight Howard, Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, Sweet Lou Hudson, Dikembe Mutombo, Artis Gilmore, Grant Hill, Mark Aguirre, Cliff Hagan, Bob Lanier, Dan Issel, David Thompson, Walt Bellamy, Neil Johnston, Spencer Haywood, and Bentley's contribution to the bottom of the list, Amari Stoudemire.
Let's go.
Well, let's bring this to a wrap, man. This was a good episode. I think we talked about some guys that get lost maybe in the shuffle of time, the shuffle of history, especially some of the guys that Ryan brought up that maybe were probably not on anybody's radar, at least not on mine or Bentley's. But we really appreciate the historical knowledge that Ryan brings to the table. What sort of closing thoughts you got, Ryan?
Well, I didn't say everybody on my list, but I do want to give a shout out to Chris Webber, who wasn't brought up. I think he should be in the conversation. And Mitch Richmond was another guy I thought about as well. I didn't mention them because they're a little more modern. I thought y'all would hit on them, but I'll toss them in at the end. I really like this exercise. I think it shows the futility in making these lists.
Yeah, right.
and how they are impossible and always up for debate, right? You could look at a top 100 list and see 100 different lists, and especially if you order them, right? If you start actually tiering them out, I mean, it is very difficult. But what you find out is people's different philosophy about a beautiful game. You find people's interpretations of eras and how people affected those eras and how the game was played during those eras, right? Because even y'all mentioned some older guys that played in a completely different era. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting exercise. I think we should do more of it. Not us, but I think the community should be talking about these things because there's a lot of people who just are forgotten, like you said. And I think it's valuable to remember those people because we wouldn't have the game if they didn't do what they did. So,
absolutely. Bentley, what are your closing thoughts here, man? Bring us home.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do things like this. I don't know that I put the importance on it that Ryan did, but Ryan is much more historically based than I am. I enjoy watching the games as they happen and leveraging my thoughts against what I can see in front of me, as I said before. But that's not to say that history is not important. I do appreciate the history aspect of the game. Doing stuff like this is very fun. I think it's cool to do it with people that also understand and think similarly or even differently than you do about the game itself and the players that are involved. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing this and looking at guys that I remember playing, but maybe not as vividly as I did, 10, 15 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fun special off-season episode of the Backyard Buckets, brought to you by Backyard Sports. We